started migrating northward, it had to be just a magnificent, multicultural, fun, exciting place, which broke my heart. I loved that place. That was my office in Cairo during my research. A bar here, the Fat Boys, has always been a bar for many, many, many years.
In October 2022, over 2,000 barges became death traps, stranded on bone-dry riverbeds. $20 billion evaporated overnight. But here's what they're not telling you. This wasn't climate change, this wasn't bad luck. Something we did 100 years ago just came back to destroy us. The footage NASA captured will haunt you. What engineers discovered beneath the surface changes everything we thought we knew. And it's already too late to stop what's coming next. The Mississippi River stretches roughly 2,300 miles from its source at Lake Itasca in Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico.
In the South, or right after the Civil War, you're a freed slave or son of slaves, you're coming up, crossing into the north.
For thousands of years, it functioned as a living system that changed with the seasons. During spring floods, the river would swell and spill across its banks, depositing nutrient-rich sediment across vast floodplains. When the waters receded in summer and autumn, they would carve new channels and leave behind fertile soil that sustained ecosystems and, eventually, human agriculture. This natural rhythm created one of the most biologically productive river systems on Earth. Before European settlement, the Mississippi was essentially unmanaged. It meandered freely across the landscape, creating oxbow lakes, wetlands, and a complex network of tributaries. Native American communities lived alongside the river for millennia, adapting their settlements and practices to its seasonal patterns rather than attempting to control it. The river's unpredictability was simply accepted as part of the natural order. That relationship began to change dramatically in the 19th century as American expansion pushed westward and river commerce became increasingly important to the growing nation's economy. Steamboats required reliable navigation channels. Towns and cities built directly on the riverbanks needed protection from flooding. Farmers wanted to cultivate the rich bottomlands without the risk of losing entire harvests to spring floods. The demand for control grew alongside the country itself. The turning point came in 1927. That spring, a combination of heavy snowmelt and relentless rainfall caused the Mississippi to overflow its banks across 7 states. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 remains one of the most destructive natural disasters in American history. According to the National Weather Service, the flood inundated more than 27,000 square miles of land, an area roughly the size of Scotland. More than 700,000 people were displaced from their homes. The death toll, while disputed, is estimated to have exceeded 500 people, with some historians suggesting the actual number was significantly higher, particularly among African American communities in the Delta region, whose losses were often underreported. Photographs from that period tell a stark story. In Greenville, Mississippi, thousands of residents, predominantly black, were forced onto the tops of levees, waiting for rescue boats that sometimes took days to arrive. Entire towns disappeared under brown floodwater. Livestock carcasses floated among the debris of destroyed homes. The economic damage was catastrophic, with losses estimated at over $400 million in 1927 currency, equivalent to roughly $6 billion today when adjusted for inflation. The disaster prompted an immediate and forceful response from the federal government. In 1928, Congress passed the Flood Control Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that fundamentally changed the relationship between Americans and their greatest river. The act gave the United States Army Corps of Engineers broad authority to manage the Mississippi and its tributaries. More importantly, it established the principle that flood control was a federal responsibility, not merely a local concern. This represented a massive shift in thinking about infrastructure and natural resources. The result was the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, which became one of the largest and most ambitious engineering undertakings in American history. The Corps of Engineers developed a comprehensive plan that included constructing thousands of miles of levees, straightening meandering sections of the river, building reservoirs and control structures, and establishing floodways that could redirect excess water during emergencies. The goal was simple in concept, but extraordinary in scale. Make the Mississippi predictable and safe. Over the following decades, this vision became reality. By the 1950s, the Mississippi was lined with levees along much of its lower course. Some of these earthen walls stood over 30 feet high and stretched for hundreds of miles without interruption. The Corps dredged the riverbed to maintain consistent depths for barge traffic. They cut through natural bends to straighten the river's path, reducing its length by roughly 150 miles between Memphis and Vicksburg alone. They built massive structures like the Old River Control Complex, completed in 1963, specifically designed to prevent the Mississippi from naturally diverting into the Atchafalaya River, a shift that would have devastated New Orleans and fundamentally altered the geography of southern Louisiana. For several decades, the system appeared to work exactly as intended. Major floods were contained within the levees. River commerce flourished as barges could reliably transport grain, coal, petroleum, and manufactured goods between the agricultural heartland and international ports. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, by the 1980s, the Mississippi River system was moving more than 500 million tons of cargo annually, making it one of the world's most important inland waterways. Cities along the river expanded. Farmland that had once been subject to regular flooding was now consistently productive, protected by the engineered barriers. Yet beneath this apparent success, subtle changes were occurring that would eventually undermine the entire system. When levees prevented the river from spreading across its floodplain, the sediment it carried no longer settled on the land. Instead, that sediment either accumulated behind dams or was flushed directly into the Gulf of Mexico. The United States Geological Survey documented that over 1.2 million acres of natural wetlands in the Mississippi Delta region disappeared between 1930 and 1980. These wetlands had served crucial functions beyond their ecological value. They acted as natural sponges during floods, absorbing and slowly releasing water. They filtered pollutants and provided habitat for fish and wildlife that supported commercial and recreational industries. The soil along the river's historic floodplain, deprived of annual deposits of fresh silt, gradually lost its natural fertility. Farmers increasingly relied on chemical fertilizers to maintain crop yields. Nitrogen and phosphate use in the region more than doubled between 1960 and 1990, according to agricultural data. These chemicals eventually washed into the river and flowed downstream, contributing to water quality problems that would become severe in later decades. By the early 2000s, some scientists and engineers were beginning to question whether the control system had created unforeseen vulnerabilities. The river had not flooded catastrophically since the system was built, which was good, but it had also lost much of its natural resilience. It could no longer adjust to changing conditions. Every function, from sediment transport to seasonal flow variation, now depended on human management and constant maintenance. The engineers who designed and built the Mississippi River Control System genuinely believed they were creating something permanent. They approached the river as a problem that could be solved through careful calculation, robust construction, and systematic maintenance. Throughout the middle decades of the 20th century, this confidence seemed entirely justified. The levees held. The floodways functioned as designed. Commerce thrived. For a generation of Americans, the managed Mississippi became the new normal, and the memory of the wild, unpredictable river began to fade. The Mississippi River and Tributaries project expanded steadily through the 1950s and 1960s. The Corps of Engineers constructed over 3,700 miles of levees and floodwalls, making it one of the longest continuous earthwork structures ever built. They established a network of reservoirs across the tributaries in the upper basin, designed to capture and hold water during heavy rainfall, then release it gradually to prevent downstream flooding. Navigation locks allowed barges to bypass dams and maintain efficient transport routes. Channel markers, depth gauges, and regular dredging operations ensured that commercial traffic could move reliably year-round. River towns that had once lived in fear of spring floods began to build directly up to the levee walls. Industrial facilities, grain elevators, and fuel depots were constructed on land that would have been underwater during the old flood cycles. In communities throughout the Mississippi Valley, monuments honoring the Corps of Engineers appeared in public squares. Local newspapers praised the technical mastery that had finally brought the Great River under control. The phrase "protect the river and it will protect you" became something of a regional motto, reflecting the belief that proper engineering could create lasting security. The economic benefits appeared substantial and immediate. With reliable water depths and protected infrastructure, the Mississippi became an even more important commercial corridor. By the 1970s, it was carrying roughly 60% of the nation's grain exports, along with massive quantities of petroleum products, coal, steel, and chemicals. The ability to move bulk cargo by barge rather than rail or truck saved industries billions of dollars annually in transportation costs. River ports from Minneapolis to New Orleans expanded their facilities and increased their workforce. For many communities, the river represented not just security from floods, but prosperity through commerce. However, the transformation of the river's natural behavior was more profound than most people realized at the time. Farmers along the lower Mississippi noticed that their soil was changing. Fields that had once received annual deposits of rich sediment during spring floods now required increasing amounts of fertilizer to produce the same yields. The United States Department of Agriculture documented a dramatic rise in nitrogen and phosphate application rates. Between 1960 and 1990, the use of these chemical fertilizers in the lower Mississippi basin nearly doubled. What the levees had taken away in natural soil enrichment, industrial agriculture now had to replace artificially. These fertilizers did not simply disappear into the soil. Rainfall and irrigation runoff carried excess nutrients into drainage ditches, then into tributaries, and eventually into the Mississippi itself. The river, which had once distributed nutrients across its floodplain where plants and wetlands could absorb them, now became a conveyor belt, pushing those same nutrients directly into the Gulf of Mexico. By the 1980s, marine biologists began documenting a massive dead zone in the Gulf where oxygen levels dropped so low that fish and other marine life could not survive. This hypoxic zone, caused primarily by nutrient pollution, would eventually grow to over 8,000 square miles during summer months, making it one of the largest areas of oxygen-depleted water in the world. The old river control structure, completed in 1963, became perhaps the most symbolic example of humanity's attempts to impose permanent order on the Mississippi. Hydrologists had determined that the river was naturally inclined to shift its main channel into the Atchafalaya River, a shorter and steeper path to the Gulf. If this diversion occurred naturally, as rivers have done throughout geological history, the current channel past Baton Rouge and New Orleans would become a minor tributary. The economic and social consequences would be devastating. New Orleans would lose its position as a major port. Industrial facilities worth billions of dollars would be stranded. Water supplies for millions of people would be disrupted. The old river control structure was engineered to prevent this natural process. It consisted of a series of dams and gates that regulated exactly how much Mississippi River water was allowed to flow into the Atchafalaya. The design maintained the historical distribution. 70% of the water would continue down the main Mississippi Channel, while 30% would divert into the Atchafalaya. When the structure was completed, newspapers described it as the facility that kept the heart of America from changing course. Engineers posed for photographs, standing atop the massive concrete installations, proud of having constrained one of nature's most powerful forces. For 2 decades, the structure performed as intended. Then, in 1973, a major flood tested the system in ways its designers had not fully anticipated. The volume and force of water strained the structure significantly. Emergency repairs were required. Engineers realized that the river was pushing against the control structure with far more energy than their models had predicted. It became clear that maintaining human control over the river's course would require constant vigilance and periodic reconstruction, not just routine maintenance. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, faith in engineering solutions remained strong within government agencies and among the general public. The Army Corps of Engineers had a proven track record of completing massive infrastructure projects. The interstate highway system was being built. Dams were being constructed throughout the western United States. The prevailing attitude held that any natural challenge could be overcome with sufficient technical expertise and resources. When problems emerged with existing river control structures, the response was typically to reinforce them or build additional facilities rather than to reconsider the fundamental approach. However, a younger generation of scientists and engineers was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. They observed that the Mississippi no longer behaved like a natural river in many respects. Its seasonal flow patterns were heavily modified by reservoir operations. Its sediment load had been dramatically reduced by upstream dams. Its connection to the surrounding landscape had been severed by continuous levees. In effect, the Mississippi had been converted from a dynamic natural system into a managed industrial canal, albeit one of enormous scale. In 2001, Dr. James Mead of the University of Missouri published research that questioned the long-term sustainability of the control system. He argued that by fundamentally altering the river's natural processes, engineers had created dependencies that would require perpetual intervention. His paper included a memorable observation that the river's heartbeat had been changed, and now humans were essentially breathing for it. The metaphor was stark but apt. The Mississippi could no longer regulate itself. Every aspect of its behavior, from flow rates to sediment distribution, now depended on human decisions and mechanical systems. These concerns remained largely academic through the 1990s and early 2000s. The levees continued to hold, commerce continued to flow. There had not been a catastrophic flood since 1973, which many interpreted as proof that the system worked. But the climate was beginning to change in ways that would challenge every assumption the control system had been built upon. Rainfall patterns across the Mississippi Basin were becoming less predictable. Some years brought extended droughts. Other years brought rainfall that exceeded historical norms. The seasonal timing of precipitation was shifting, with spring rains sometimes arriving earlier or later than traditional patterns suggested they would. By 2012, these changing conditions produced a crisis that revealed how vulnerable the controlled river had become. A severe drought gripped the Midwest throughout the summer and into autumn. Reservoir levels dropped. Tributaries slowed to a trickle. The main channel of the Mississippi, which had been dredged and straightened to maintain consistent depths, began to fall below the levels required for barge navigation. At Memphis, water levels dropped to their lowest point in nearly 70 years, approaching depths not seen since measurements began. Satellite imagery from NASA showed long stretches of exposed riverbed, with the water channel appearing as a narrow brown ribbon rather than the broad waterway that had existed for decades. More than 100 barges ran aground or were unable to load fully because of insufficient depth. Port operations slowed dramatically. Grain shipments from the Midwest faced delays that rippled through agricultural markets. The Corps of Engineers deployed dredging equipment to deepen critical sections, essentially excavating the riverbed to maintain navigation channels. But this was treating a symptom rather than addressing the underlying problem. The controlled river lacked the natural flexibility to adapt to extreme conditions. It had been optimized for average conditions that were no longer reliable. Farmers and river operators who had spent their entire lives along the Mississippi expressed disbelief at what they were witnessing. One agricultural operator in Louisiana told reporters that the river no longer looked like the Mississippi he had known. The water was too low, the current too weak, the channel too narrow. Dead fish appeared along exposed mudflats. The sound of dredging equipment, running day and night to maintain shipping channels, replaced the natural sounds of the river. This drought revealed a fundamental problem that would only worsen in subsequent years. The system that had been built to protect against floods had inadvertently made the river more vulnerable to droughts. With wetlands eliminated and natural overflow areas cut off behind levees, the Mississippi had lost more than 40% of its natural water storage capacity compared to 1940, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. During wet periods, water rushed through the controlled channel more quickly, unable to spread and slow across floodplains. During dry periods, there were no reserves to draw from. The river had become less resilient to both extremes. As the drought persisted into 2013, another unexpected consequence emerged. Salt water from the Gulf of Mexico began creeping upstream into the lower Mississippi. Normally, the river's outflow is strong enough to hold back the denser seawater. But with flow rates dramatically reduced, the salt wedge advanced more than 100 miles inland, threatening drinking water supplies for communities in southeastern Louisiana. Water treatment facilities were not designed to handle brackish water. Residents faced the possibility that their taps might become undrinkable, an almost unthinkable situation for people living beside what was supposed to be one of North America's mightiest freshwater rivers. The problems that surfaced during the 2012 drought were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper instability within the Mississippi River system. Throughout the 2010s, the river began behaving in ways that confounded the engineers who had spent decades studying and managing it. The predictable patterns that had allowed for reliable flood forecasting and navigation planning were breaking down. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, between 2016 and 2019, at least 15 unusual flood events occurred across the Mississippi River system. What made these floods particularly puzzling was that total rainfall amounts often fell within normal historical ranges. The floods were not necessarily coming from exceptional storms. They were emerging from within the river system itself. Hydrologists studying these events discovered that the character of flooding had fundamentally changed. In a natural river system, floodwaters spread across wide floodplains, slowing the peak flow and allowing water to dissipate gradually. The levee system prevented this natural spreading. Instead, water was forced to remain within the main channel, where it moved faster and with greater force. The United States Geological Survey documented a phenomenon they termed structural self-erosion. The confined river was scouring its own bed, eating away at sediment layers that had been stable for generations. The faster current carved the channel deeper, which paradoxically created more capacity for catastrophic flooding during extreme events, while also making the river more vulnerable to low water levels during droughts. In May 2019, the Army Corps of Engineers faced a decision that illustrated just how precarious the situation had become. Spring rainfall in the upper Mississippi Basin had been heavy, and the reservoirs designed to capture and hold excess water were approaching capacity. The Corps was forced to open the gates at the old river control structure 2 months earlier than scheduled. When the gates opened, the release was dramatic. News footage captured water erupting through the structure with tremendous force, carrying red mud and debris from deep within the river system. The discharge shot upward nearly to the level of the bridge deck above, a visual reminder of the immense hydraulic pressure that had built up behind the structure. Engineers monitoring the release detected something troubling. Vibrations from the water flow were traveling through the foundation of the structure and along the levees for miles in both directions. Sensitive instruments measured these oscillations, which one engineer later described as resembling an irregular heartbeat. The river, after nearly a century of forced regulation, was exhibiting stress patterns that suggested the control system itself was becoming unstable. Each time the gates opened and closed, each time water was forced to follow paths dictated by human engineering. Rather than natural topography, the underlying tensions increased. The impacts extended well beyond the immediate vicinity of the control structures. Throughout the lower Mississippi Basin, from Vicksburg to Baton Rouge, groundwater levels began declining noticeably. The deeper channel was effectively draining the surrounding aquifer. Wells that had reliably provided water for decades started going dry. By 2019, the lower basin recorded its lowest groundwater levels in more than 70 years. For thousands of rural households and small farms that depended on wells rather than municipal water systems, this created a genuine crisis. The economic cost of drilling deeper wells or connecting to distant water supplies fell hardest on communities that were already economically marginal. In Louisiana, the groundwater decline compounded another growing problem. The saltwater wedge from the Gulf of Mexico, which had briefly appeared during the 2012 drought, returned with greater persistence. Saltwater is denser than fresh water, and it naturally tends to flow upstream along the bottom of a river channel when the freshwater flow weakens. Under normal conditions, the Mississippi's discharge is strong enough to prevent significant saltwater intrusion, but with reduced flow and a deeper, more efficient channel that allowed saltwater to penetrate farther inland, the intrusion became a recurring threat. By late 2019, saltwater had advanced more than 100 miles up the river, reaching areas where it had never been detected before in recorded history. Plaquemines Parish, a rural area southeast of New Orleans, faced a particularly severe impact. The parish water system drew from the river, and treatment facilities were not equipped to remove salt. As salinity levels rose, water from taps became increasingly brackish. Health officials warned that prolonged consumption of water with elevated salt content posed risks, particularly for people with hypertension or kidney problems. Thousands of families had to rely on bottled water for drinking and cooking, a situation that lasted for months. The economic consequences rippled outward from these local disruptions. Louisiana's seafood industry, which depends on the mixing zone where fresh water from the Mississippi meets the Gulf, experienced unusual changes in marine populations. Oyster beds, which require specific salinity levels to thrive, were damaged as the balance between fresh and salt water shifted. Commercial fishermen reported changes in the distribution of species they had tracked for generations. The modifications to the river's flow were altering the entire coastal ecosystem in ways that would take years to fully understand. When heavy rains finally returned, they brought their own set of problems. With nowhere for excess water to spread naturally, floods within the levee system became more violent and destructive. The water rebounded off the levee walls and surged through the main channel with increased velocity. In Illinois, sections of riverbank near previously stable communities began to collapse. In 2020, a segment of riverbank near Grafton gave way suddenly, and 12 homes were lost within 2 weeks. The erosion was not gradual, it was catastrophic, as entire sections of earth simply slid into the river, taking structures and property with them. Downstream communities responded by reinforcing their levees, building them higher and stronger. But engineers were beginning to realize that this approach was fundamentally flawed. Each time levees were raised in one location, hydraulic pressure increased elsewhere in the system. The river simply sought out the next weakest point. At a conference of the United States Society on Dams, one veteran engineer made a candid admission that circulated widely among his colleagues. He said that every time they built another wall, the Mississippi just needed one more storm to prove it was stronger. It was a recognition that the battle for control was not being won through ever larger structures. The environmental damage extended beyond the immediate river corridor. Sediment that would naturally have replenished farmland along the Mississippi was instead trapped behind dams or flushed directly into the Gulf of Mexico. Without this natural fertilization, farmers had become entirely dependent on industrial fertilizers. The use of nitrogen and phosphorus compounds continued to increase throughout the 2010s. These chemicals, washing off fields during rainstorms, flowed into the river and downstream to the Gulf, where they fed massive algae blooms. When the algae died and decomposed, they consumed oxygen in the water, creating the expanding dead zone that made large areas of the Gulf essentially lifeless during summer months. By 2020, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico had grown to more than 8,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of New Jersey. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, this hypoxic zone represented one of the largest human-caused environmental disasters in North American waters. The fishing industry in the Gulf suffered measurable losses. Species that could not tolerate low oxygen levels either died or migrated away from affected areas. The ecological damage created a feedback loop. Dams trapped sediment, which weakened soil fertility, which increased fertilizer use, which polluted the river, which created dead zones in the Gulf, which damaged fisheries that coastal communities depended upon. The river system was no longer just a waterway. It had become a conduit for accumulated environmental problems flowing from the continental interior to the sea. In October 2022, the vulnerabilities of the entire system converged in a crisis that captured national attention. A drought that began in the summer intensified through the autumn, reducing the Mississippi to water levels not seen in modern records. More than 2,000 grain barges became stranded between Memphis and New Orleans, unable to navigate the shallow channel. The timing could not have been worse. Autumn is the critical season for transporting the Midwest's grain harvest to export terminals. Corn and soybeans that should have been moving downriver to New Orleans sat instead in storage facilities throughout Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. Reuters estimated the economic impact at over $20 billion. Grain prices surged as international buyers worried about supply disruptions. Corn prices jumped 25% in just 6 weeks. Soybean prices followed a similar trajectory. Farmers who had counted on selling their harvest at specific times found themselves paying to store grain they could not ship. Ethanol plants in Illinois, which depend on reliable corn supplies and efficient transportation, shut down production lines. Fuel distributors throughout the Midwest faced supply constraints. The ripple effects touched virtually every sector of the agricultural economy. In river towns, the low water revealed landscapes that many residents had never seen. Sandbars emerged in the middle of the main channel. Historical artifacts, including old steamboat wrecks from the 19th century, appeared above the waterline for the first time in living memory. The Corps of Engineers deployed their entire fleet of dredging equipment, working around the clock to maintain a navigable channel for the barges that were still attempting to operate. The sound of dredges became constant in riverside communities, a mechanical grinding that replaced the natural sounds of flowing water. A reporter for the Associated Press described the scene in St. Louis as surreal, barges designed to float in water sat tilted on exposed riverbeds. Workers operated heavy machinery in areas that should have been underwater. The air smelled of diesel fuel and disturbed sediment rather than the river itself. One local resident, interviewed on the riverbank, said quietly that they no longer heard the river anymore, only the sound of metal and engines. It was an observation that captured something essential about what had been lost. The Mississippi, in its controlled and managed state, had ceased to be a living river in any traditional sense. It had become an industrial facility that happened to involve water. In southern Louisiana, where the saltwater intrusion had become a persistent problem, the 2022 drought pushed the situation to a breaking point. With minimal freshwater flow, salt advanced farther upstream than ever before. A commercial fisherman standing beside water that should have been fresh noted that it had become saltier than tears. The metaphor was not merely poetic, it reflected a genuine sense of loss among people whose lives and livelihoods had been shaped by the river for generations. The crisis of 2022 forced a reckoning that had been delayed for decades. For the first time since the great engineering projects began, serious voices within the federal government and scientific community began questioning whether the control system could be sustained at all. The problem was no longer theoretical or projected into some distant future. It was immediate, measurable, and costly. The Mississippi River, which had been transformed into what many considered an engineering triumph, was failing in fundamental ways. In early 2023, the Army Corps of Engineers initiated a series of emergency pilot projects that represented a significant departure from nearly a century of river management philosophy. Rather than building more levees or dredging the channel deeper, these projects focused on reconnecting the river to portions of its historic floodplain. The concept, which scientists called sediment diversion, involved opening controlled outlets that would allow water and sediment to flow into areas that had been cut off from the river for generations. The goal was not to eliminate flooding entirely, but to allow the river to behave somewhat more naturally within carefully managed parameters. The first sediment diversion gates opened in Louisiana in the spring of 2023. When the gates lifted, muddy water laden with sediment surged through channels that had been dry for decades. The water spread across land that had turned white and cracked from salt accumulation and lack of freshwater input. Within weeks, the changes were visible. Grasses and reeds that had not grown in those areas for generations began to sprout. The sediment deposited by the diverted water created conditions similar to the natural floodplain that had once characterized the delta. Migratory birds, which had avoided the area for years, began to return. However, these restoration efforts faced significant opposition from affected communities. River towns that had developed based on the assumption of a permanently controlled river viewed any loosening of that control with deep suspicion. Farmers worried that sediment-laden water would clog irrigation systems or damage crops. Property owners near proposed diversion sites feared that their land values would decline or that their homes would be threatened by redirected water. At community meetings throughout Louisiana, heated debates erupted. One farmer stated bluntly that what officials called restoration, he called gambling with his livelihood. At the federal level, multiple agencies began coordinating on what they termed an adaptive flow model. Rather than attempting to fix the river in a single configuration, this approach would allow controlled variations that mimicked some aspects of natural seasonal patterns. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, working with the Environmental Protection Agency and the United States Geological Survey, developed computer models that could predict how different flow scenarios would affect everything from sediment transport to saltwater intrusion. The goal was to manage the river more intelligently, responding to changing conditions rather than trying to impose a static plan. NASA contributed to these efforts by deploying satellite monitoring systems that tracked the river from space. High-resolution imagery could detect subtle changes in water temperature, sediment load, vegetation health along the banks, and even subsurface moisture levels in the surrounding landscape. This data was fed into predictive models that helped engineers decide when to open diversion gates, how much water to release from upstream reservoirs, and where dredging efforts should be concentrated. Some researchers describe this approach as using artificial intelligence to develop empathy for the river. Despite these technological advances, many scientists acknowledge that they were only beginning to address damage that had accumulated over nearly a century. The climate itself was continuing to change in ways that made the river's behavior increasingly difficult to predict. Rainy seasons were becoming more erratic. Droughts were more intense when they occurred. A young engineer working on restoration projects in Baton Rouge gave an interview that captured the changing mindset within his profession. He admitted that his generation of engineers was learning humility, discovering that sometimes the only way to save a river was to stop trying to control every aspect of its behavior. Restoration efforts extended beyond the main channel of the Mississippi. In Missouri, geology students and environmental organizations began working to restore portions of historic floodplains that had been converted to agriculture decades earlier. The process involved removing or setting back levees to allow periodic flooding, reintroducing native vegetation, and monitoring how the land responded to renewed connection with the river. In Louisiana, young ecologists planted mangroves and marsh grasses in areas where sediment diversions had deposited fresh material. Research from the United States Geological Survey provided some reason for cautious optimism. Their models suggested that if the Mississippi could regain even 20% of its natural overbank flow capacity, the delta could begin meaningful ecological recovery within 30 years. This was not a quick fix, but a slow process of allowing natural systems to gradually rebuild functionality that had been suppressed for generations. The economic implications remained contentious. Industries that had developed around the assumption of a permanently controlled river faced difficult adjustments. Barge operators needed reliable water depths. Farmers required protection from catastrophic flooding. Cities needed secure water supplies. Balancing these economic needs against ecological sustainability created complex policy challenges. Insurance companies began reassessing flood risk, recognizing that the control system provided less protection than previously believed. Some towns initiated managed retreat programs, helping residents relocate away from the most vulnerable areas. Educational institutions began incorporating river ecology and adaptive management into their curricula for engineering and environmental science students. The next generation was being trained with different assumptions than their predecessors, learning to think about rivers as dynamic systems, requiring flexibility rather than rigid control. An engineer standing near one of the sediment diversion sites spoke about his hopes for the future. He said that if the river came back to life one day, he hoped it would forgive the damage that had been done. It was a statement that reflected not just technical optimism, but a deeper recognition of moral responsibility. The Mississippi had not disappeared and would not disappear. It remained a powerful presence in the American landscape. The question facing the current generation was whether partial restoration was possible, allowing for greater ecological health alongside continued human use. The river, patient and persistent, would continue flowing regardless of what humans decided.